We have a new quarter starting today, and the title of the lessons for the new quarter is the Cosmic Message. And it's really based on Revelation 14, those few verses that deal with what we have so affectionately known as the three angels' messages. But the first couple of lessons, and I noticed getting my pamphlet just yesterday, that the lessons at the end of the week also, or at the end of the quarter I should say, they are tending to branch beyond Revelation 14 and pulling it all together. So it's really a study out of Revelation for this next quarter. That'll make it an interesting study. All right, now I know the deacons have just collected up the offering, but I'm going to ask the deacons if they wouldn't mind, or two deacons, to get a pile of Bibles each. If you do not have a text with you, as in the Bible for Revelation 12, if you do not have one with you, I would love you to just put your hand up, take one of the Bibles, so that we can all use the Bible as the source in our text as we are studying today. We are, as you possibly have noted, we are this week looking at the theme of Jesus wins and Satan loses. And that obviously is the chapter we've gone back to is Revelation 12 here to get an overview. So folks, if you don't have a device to open up to Revelation 12, or if you don't have a Bible in your purse or in your pocket or something like that, then please put your hand up and the deacons will happily source you with one so that we can all be in this together. I do want to try and get you focused in the Word as much as on the screen as we go along. All right, now, as I said, this week's lesson has been focused almost solely on Revelation 12. And it has, as you've noticed just a moment ago, it has this title, Jesus Wins, Satan Loses. Opened up with an illustration in the beginning of the lesson by saying it's very interesting to notice that in history there have been some significant battles that have been won by a minority, by a small group of soldiers or a small army compared to a massive, renowned army. And for example, there's one of Hannibal's victories at Carthage that also mentions Alexander the Great, you know, how he defeated the empire at Persia, etc. And so it's reminding us, if you feel you're on the small side, don't be alarmed, because this chapter tells us, as an introduction to chapter 14, that Jesus wins, Satan loses. We know in the end what the outcome will be. All right, now to just perhaps get your mind around that for a minute, I want you to have a look. Wouldn't you think if you want to know the outcome of a book, you go to the last chapter or the last few pages and you read through there and you kind of work out, you know, what's being said and how it's all going to end. Now, so if we go to the last verse of the chapter 17, and it says, "Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's command and hold to the testimony of Jesus." That doesn't tell us Jesus wins. Just says the dragon he's wroth, he's mad, and he's out to make whatever havoc he can do. But somewhere in this chapter, there is a clue as to Jesus wins, Satan loses in the ultimate sense. And that's the focus that I want to come to as we move throughout the chapter. Now, first of all, I just make that as a summary statement, I guess, of what we've been saying thus far, and that is that really Revelation 12, as far as Revelation 14 is concerned, it's a good chapter, it's a good background to the three angels' message, because it gives us a setting or a backdrop against which these three cosmic messengers deliver their messages, and for which we connect with very much. So that's basically what the chapter is about. Now, before we get into it, I noticed on a Wednesday section of the lesson, it mentioned the word historicism, or it might have been historicist. Now, I would like to just take a couple of minutes here at the beginning of the quarter to make a perspective of how we approach the book of Revelation. I'm going to ask, and I have this time pre-primed some people for questions and so on. So I'm going to ask Rick if he would share with us Thanks, Rick. If he would share with us, what do you understand? What's historicism, Rick?
Yeah, thanks, Russell. There are several interpretations of prophecy, and historicism is one that's actually been around for quite a long time. It predates the Adventist Church. Even the reformers, or many of the reformers, adhere to this. Yes. But certainly since the beginning of the Adventist Church and right throughout, it's been the predominant understanding of how prophecies played out. And the idea is that it's an historical unravelling of prophecy from the days of Babylon, when Daniel talked about or interpreted the dream of the king of Babylon, right through to the present day. It's an unravelling of prophecy. We're all experiencing it. We're all involved in it. Right throughout the Dark Ages, the Papal period, all of that has been an unravelling of those prophecies.
That's terrific, Rick. Thank you very much for that. Now, you're happy to agree with my own definition of historicism then? That basically it's an interpretation that spans history from the time the prophet gives his message right through to the time of the end. And in the case of Revelation, that's basically the whole Christian era into the second coming of Christ and beyond into the millennium and the new earth. Okay? So that's where we are with historicism. Rick, give us probably the two other most popular, because there are quite a number of different perspectives and views on how to interpret prophecies like the Apocalypse and the Book of Daniel, etc. Do you have a couple of other interpretations? What have you got?
You're lucky, Russell. I sure do. Well done.
Good. You must have listened well.
These two, preterism and futurism, as you can see on the screen there, these are two more recent interpretations of prophecy. Preterism is the idea that all of it was fulfilled by the end of the 1st century AD. That during that time, all of the events that we understand, including end-time events, were fulfilled. And in fact, you can break preterism into two parts. One of them is full preterism, which includes the second coming of Jesus in a spiritual sense. But there's also an idea of partial preterism, where all prophecy has been fulfilled except for the second coming of Jesus.
Okay.
Which lends itself to the idea that Jesus could just return at any moment. Right. It doesn't have to be any other fulfillment of prophecy. He could just appear.
Oh, that's good, Rick. Okay, and again, have I kind of summarised it? Remember, I've got very few words here to get the font large enough for people to read. Does that summarise it for you? Are you happy with that? An interpretation which is limited to the past and the present events. It does, as you say, go a little bit into the future. And in fact, I think in one source we were looking at, it actually indicated that often Revelation has been interpreted by preterists even as far as Constantine. That's the 4th century AD. So, but no further. So the great Antichrist, comes at that stage and so on. So anyway, thank you, Rick. What about futurism?
Yes, futurism is an interesting one too. It looks at prophecy as being fulfilled way in the future. This idea of the 7 last years of tribulation, all of it will be fulfilled during that brief period of time. So it's not happening, it didn't happen in the past, it's not happening now, but it will happen at some distant point in the future.
Right. Thank you, Rick. We appreciate your defining those 3 prophetic approaches to interpretation. Now, can I ask another question of you, Rick? And you can, I noticed the microphone's gone back to the next speaker, and that's okay. As Seventh-day Adventists, where have we traditionally gone with our understanding of prophecy? Which of those 3 do we predominate with our understanding of prophecy?
Yeah, it's definitely historicism.
Yeah. Okay. So we are historicists. Now, I'd like to just show you something here, and this will, I think, help you a little understand why it is that we've been so strong in wanting to stick to our historicist view. I have just gone back to a word or two now in case you've forgotten which of each of those views are being listed there. So for the historicist, it spans all history from the time given right through to the last day events, okay? This was the view that was really, it was the one that was really popularised by the Protestant Reformation. The reformers, you can go to almost any reformer And if you look up their works, look up their sermons, etc., you'll find that they have very clearly interpreted the mark of the beast and the beast and the little horn and so on as the enemy that they were fighting against at the time, the papacy. All right? And they were historicists, and they went, right through prophecies and interpret them in a very similar vein to what we did. And now they weren't the first to do it, but they certainly were amongst those who really popularised the whole view of historicism, of which we are a child of the Reformation too. Okay? It's interesting to notice, and I'll just do this very quickly, it's interesting to notice that there were two Spanish Jesuit priests who, in what was called the Counter-Reformation, this is when the papacy, the Catholic Church, decided, well, we're going to catch up on reform as well, and we will do some bit of reformation. And so part of their Reformation approach was that these two men, as I said, they were Jesuit priests from Spain, and they set out and they came up with new interpretations or a new approach of interpreting of prophecies. The first, actually he was the second one, was Alcazar. He actually took up and popularised the preterist view. And so that's why the preterist view is still very much around today. But there was another person just a few years before him actually, but also really post-Reformation, and it's Ribera. Ribera, he's still in Spain but working in a different corner, came up with a totally different theory and said, no, it's all in the future. You can see why very quickly the Catholic Church took to those two views of interpretation, because they felt it got the heat off them from what the reformers were saying about the prophecies that were made about them. They saw this as being very, very appropriate. So I thought it would be just handy for us to have a look at that as we set out to study the book of Revelation, realising that as Adventists, we are historicists. We look at it from the point of view that it fits from the beginning of history, on first century, when John wrote the book of Revelation down, going right through to the second coming of Christ, right into the millennium, into the new earth. It's all there. All right, now, we're going to, at this stage, begin our journey. And I would like Ron now, please. Pastor Ron, would you mind just quickly identifying, these are the three major symbols that keep appearing throughout the chapter. It's a woman, a dragon, and a man-child. Would you make a summary for each of those, perhaps in that order, then I'll just flick on when you've identified and see if we, again, have matched here. But what have you got, Ron, for us? Who's the woman representing here?
Yeah, it's an interesting chapter Revelation 12, because I think it sets an understanding of some of the more difficult chapters in Revelation. And it starts off with a woman. There are three symbols, as you've said, and the first one recorded is a pure woman, Revelation 12, 1-2. And it talks about the pure woman. It says, a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth.
You're taking the next person's job, Ron. Don't read it all.
Okay.
Just give us a summary. Who's the woman representing at this stage?
The woman represents the pure church.
Okay. So the church. Now, Ron, what I'd like you to do, can you give me from the text, is there something that helps you to conclude that this woman is the church?
Well, there are a number of texts in Revelation 12, but one of the significant verses, I think, is verse 6 about the pure woman. It says, the woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days.
Okay. And you connect that experience with the church being pursued by the dragon?
Yes.
Well, who's the dragon?
Well, the dragon is the devil.
And what evidence in the text for that is there?
Well, I think there are several verses in Revelation 12, but I think the significant ones are verses 7-9, and there was war in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought, against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth.
No mistaking that, is there?
No.
It's quite clear. It actually says that the dragon is Satan. All right. Finally, who's the male child born of the woman?
Right, the birth of the male child, as it's recorded in Revelation 12:5, represents Christ.
Okay. All right. So we have now Christ being represented, also being called Michael. Again, can I ask Ron, where do you see coming out of the text, where would be your support text to convince somebody that this child born of the church is Christ? What's one of the real punchy verses that kind of supports the idea?
Well, I feel verse 5 is the strongest verse.
Righto.
It says there, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne.
Okay.
And this obviously is Christ.
Right. And a reference to the ascension, do you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. Look, thank you, Ron, for sharing that. So now we have the three major symbols that we're looking at in the book, and already you've begun to get some interpretation through what Ron has shared with us and read there in those verses. Now, what I want to do is this. I want to, as a group, as we now go through the chapter, I want you to see that the chapter is actually divided up into 5 scenes. Some say 4. I prefer to divide it and say 5. And they are in the verses here. And what we're going to do is that we're going to, first of all, read each of those verses as you have these, just one line of description up there on the screen. And once we've finished reading it, and I will make a couple of comments, at that stage the font size will get much, much smaller, while the next ones come up in large fonts so you can read them. But in the first 5 verses, Fran, would you like to read for us, please? The first 5 verses here of Revelation 12. And this is the first scene, and as it's described here, this is the early conflict in the church between the dragon, Satan, and the woman. Okay, let's read.
A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne.
Okay. Look, I feel that there's no need for us to go, and I had no intention of looking at great detail here, but as an overview from what we've said so far, particularly what Ron has shared with us, we can see that this is representing the early church, at that stage even, I guess you'd say, Israel. And it's from Israel that Mary gives birth to the male child, and it's the establishment of the early Christian church. And at that time also, we find out that Christ will ascend back to God. He seems to escape the dragon, but does he, as we'll see in a moment. All right, so there's the first one, the first segment. Let's now go to scene number 2. Now you'll see with scene number, oops, I forgot I actually was tempted to put just a couple of pictures in with each of these 5 scenes, and there they are. And now we go to the second scene. The woman here is being persecuted by the dragon and is being pursued into the wilderness. Now, you will notice as we read, we will start in verse 6 and then jump down to verse 13, because this chapter, or this era, this scene is interrupted by some verses in between that we'll have a look at after this one. Okay, thank you again, Fran.
The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times and half a time, out of the serpent's head. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and swept her away with the torment.
Okay, so we can see, thank you, Fran, we can see from this reading that this is representing the Christian church now, right down through the medieval years that are identified by the time prophecy. They've taken the longest time prophecy there from the book of Daniel, and it's mentioned in 2 forms. One form, it's 3.5 days, which again, historicists would look at that and say, that the 3.5 days is the same as the 1,260 days. Sorry, it's 3.5 times, my apologies. And then that's the same terminology as we found from the book of Daniel representing the 1,260 days. All right, in other parts of Revelation, by the way, you're going to find it 42 months. It's all the same period of time. It's the medieval period of the Christian church when the church was dominated from Rome. And at the end of that era, we find that the Protestantism arises. And it seems that with the arise of Protestantism, so it is that we have the arise of persecution. It had been around before, but it was now multiplied many times over. And so you've got, obviously the story of the Waldenses is an illustration of one group of people who had seclusion for a good period of time from the dragon. But then, of course, they went through periods of persecution as well. And when we come to our second last scene, we'll find that there was some help to the woman at this point in time. It'll be interesting to see what that is as well. But now we need to go back. And so we're going back now to look at scene 3. And scene 3 is what I call the scene behind the scenes. This is, if you can imagine, a great big theatre that has 4 stages set on it, one rolling through, one after the other. But in the middle of scene 2, suddenly the curtain is pulled aside, and behind you get another scene, and this is telling you why this conflict has happened. This is telling you where this conflict started, and who are the main characters in the conflict again, and how that pours itself out. So, friend, if we now can have verses 7 to 12 read here, and remember, this is the scene behind the scenes. We're jumping right back to see what has caused this controversy between Satan and the church.
And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short."
Okay, thank you, Fran. And we're stretching your voice for you, aren't we? We've only got 2 verses to go, though. So thank you. All right, so here we have the controversy that we know very well. We frequently refer to these verses talking about the original struggle in heaven between Lucifer, who raised up against God and eventually was cast out. And Michael, Christ, is the one here responsible for him being cast out. He's hurled down. I love the language. Now, There are a few verses here in this segment that I'm deliberately going to skip over and use as my conclusion, and I'm nearly there anyway because look at the time. But let's now have a look and see, let's race ahead now and have a look at the fourth scene where it says that the earth helps the woman. Thank you, Fran, that one verse.
But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth.
Thank you. It has generally been understood that that is a reference to the establishment of America, a land of religious freedom. Civil and religious freedoms were the two centre poles, if you like, of what America was founded on. And it came at a time, because the persecution was becoming so strong out of the Reformation, that the one way people sought to escape, some tried to escape to different countries on the continent and got some protection, but not total protection, until the Pilgrim Fathers got together in the Mayflower and of course all the other ships that followed and set up a new colony, a new country, America, where they could worship freely. Often people see that as the fulfilment of those words. I also see another factor, I believe, was while the Reformation immediately brought confrontation and more persecution, ultimately, eventually, the Reformation brought peace. And so that's a point that could be mentioned there. Now lastly, our last scene is now Revelation verse 5 here in chapter 12. Thank you, Fran.
Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and build and hold to the testimony of Jesus.
Thank you. Okay, we know this one very well, don't we? Because this is a description of what's going to happen, what's ahead for us even still. This is not fully fulfilled yet, this. But can you see from the start of verse 1 right through to verse 17 of Revelation 12, it is taking in chunks, and we've suggested 4 chunks of history from the first advent of Christ to the second advent of Christ. It's a great overview, and it's an overview that fits in as a very satisfactory introduction to Revelation 12. Now, here's my conclusion. At the beginning, I asked this question, and I said, Jesus wins, Satan loses. Where do we get the support for this kind of thinking from this chapter? I'm going to suggest to you that the answer comes by looking at this chapter as what we call a chiasm. A chiasm, the actual word chi is the Greek letter CH. It appears like a big X. You can see the orange X on the screen. And you've got the first letter corresponds to the last letter. The second section, B, corresponds to the B at the bottom. Can you see that? In other words, they come as a parallel into the centre and most important point. All right? And the chiasm, and look, here it is, but you can't read that, and I knew you weren't able to read that, but I hope you can read what's in the middle of the chiasm. It's verse what? 11. Oh, some of you can see it. In fact, perhaps if I'd gone to Specsavers, I might be able to see it too. Actually, I have been to Specsavers. I'm just waiting to throw these $20 glasses away and get my ordered glasses. But in the meantime, here's the chiasm. The centre of the chiasm says, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. Now, I've put the whole verse up on the screen where you can read it. This is saying, because it's at the centre of the chiasm, this is the key point of the chapter. Just as Michael overcame to heaven and cast him out of heaven, just as we see Christ leading the church through the wilderness, and just as we see that there is victory for Christ even at the original. I mean, Satan tried to kill him at birth, tried to destroy him on the cross, but he was raised to guarantee our resurrection from the grave when he comes again. And he was ascended to heaven. It's all here. It tells us that Christ was victorious and he rules with an iron rod. That's why we know who wins in the end. And that's why this chapter is so important when we come to the book of Revelation, because it gives us a great overview of which the rest of the book of Revelation pulls out in bits and pieces and expands on it. But in the end, who wins? Christ wins. And that's the victory that we're all looking forward to and want to be very much a part of, and to be an overcomer with Christ, just as he promises those who take his blood. It's all about the cross, isn't it? It's very central in the chapter. As we take on the cross, we take on the blood of Christ, we are guaranteed to be overcomers of him, the devil. And that's the promise of this chapter, and I hope it's a promise that you're able to claim as your own as well. Let's bow our heads for a prayer. Father, we thank you that we've had an opportunity at looking at a chapter that has important messages for us. A very central message is that overcoming is possible for us in the power of the blood. In Christ's sacrifice on the cross, we know that we can be overcomers over the devil, and that we can be guaranteed that there's a place for us in your kingdom. And irrespective of what may come, it could be trouble, it could be persecution. We don't know how long we have, how much freedom we have, and for how long. But irrespective of what comes, we know that in Christ, our eternity is guaranteed. And for that, we thank you. And these things we're able to pray in Jesus' worthy name. Amen.